So today I'm using some supplies from Hippie Crafter, a small company based in Florida, and they asked me if I would review some of their supplies. They sent me their watercolor paper, which is 11 by 15. It comes in a 2-pack, 15 sheets each. It's 140-pound cold press. They also sent me acrylic paint markers that are 25 colors, and it comes with replacement nibs. You can replace the nib with the chisel point, which is pretty cool. So my plan is to create some painterly backgrounds, some in watercolor, some in ink, and acrylic paint, and then I'm going to do some drawings on top of these painterly backgrounds. I'm going to start with liquid watercolors. I buy these in the primary colors, and I mix my secondary colors in a white ice cube tray. I'm really going to be putting this paper to the test because I love to work watercolors wet into wet, wet on wet, whatever it's called, wet in wet. So I start with a big brush and clear water. With a smaller brush, I start to drop the liquid watercolors into the water, and it should flow, only where the water is. This is the first one that I did, so I'm a little fussy with it. Later you'll see me, being much looser with it, but I was trying to get something really free, looking like a splatter and a splash, but allowing the watercolor to puddle and, create many different gradations of color on its own. So I do a bunch of these watercolor backgrounds, and the paper does ripple a little bit, but not too bad. And with really wet watercolor, it's not ideal that the paper ripples because the water is going to pool in the low spots. But it's okay for what I end up doing with it because I'm doing something so freeform that the way it dries kind of creates interesting patterns that I then use and draw over. So I'm not too upset about it. And maybe if you wet the watercolor paper first and stretched it, the way they teach you in art school, or the way professional watercolor artists actually use watercolor paper. But like I said, I wasn't too upset about it because it's going to create some really interesting patterns when it dries. So now I've moved on to working with inks. And I could water down these inks, but I'm using them full strength, just like the watercolors were used full strength. And I'm letting the water on the paper do, the watering down or making of the patterns. Here I'm just using it full strength like a brush. With a big brush. So I'm really warmed up now and having fun with this. I want to get like some really expressionistic splatters or brush strokes, and I do that with the water first, and then I just start pouring the ink into it and letting it move around. This is really fun. Now, some of these you will not see me draw on in this video because I had way too much footage, so I'm going to create a second video if you're interested in just watching how I do different drawings. So here is acrylic paint, and I chose gray because I thought the bright colors would pop off the gray. So I really recommend that you go ahead and make yourself a color chart with, and I feel like I should have done this first, but I did it second. So I'm recreating little color swatches of all the colors that are in my paintings, and I'm going to test the markers on here. So the top part of my chart is watercolor, and the bottom part of my chart is the ink colors. And the acrylic paint I did on a separate piece of paper. So I let all my backgrounds dry and I stuck them under books for actually a couple days because yes, they were a little ripply. So now I want to test my paint markers, and each one is wrapped separately in plastic. That's so in shipping they don't leak all over each other. So also you need to get the nib, the paint down into the nib. So here I'm showing you up close how that works. And you really need to shake them well. There's a ball in there that's mixing the paint. So don't just press the tip here like I'm doing to get the ink down. You need to shake it really well. Even after you've let them sit for a little bit and you're going to pick them up to use them again, you need to shake them really well or the paint will come out transparent and not opaque. So here we go. I finally got one of these nibs working. And I even made a color chart because there was 25 colors, and I wanted to get to know my colors. I don't always do this. I'm not methodical like this usually. And you can see all the colors that come in the pack. All the pinks and yellows, greens, purples, blues, a couple, a taupe and a gray, which are fantastic, fun, and a gold and a silver. Here I'm testing my colors on gray paper and also a darker gray because I almost wish I would have used a darker gray. So the light, bright colors really pop off of gray.
So it looks very
Okay, moving on to my color chart that is watercolor and ink. On the watercolor, the marker kind of seeps into the paper because watercolor has not sealed the paper. And each marker looks different on different colors because it's almost mixing with the color underneath. So you can see here that pink on top of green looks completely different than when I use it on top of, say, this dark black.
Oh, that's ink.
Another thing that happens when you're drawing on top of the watercolor is the paint marker picks up some of the watercolor color. So when I use the paint markers on watercolor, you're going to see I go ahead and clean the tip on scrap paper in between sometimes. So it's not like a huge problem. It's just something to be aware of. Okay, now I'm going to test the same marker on ink colors. So inks are permanent and they've sealed the paper. So the paint marker is going to glide better over the ink colors and also look more opaque. The first one I chose to work on is a watercolor painting, and I highly recommend getting your marker warmed up on scrap paper. I wasn't sure how the marker was going to work on the watercolor after I did my tests, and I could tell that the marker color kind of seeped into the watercolor, but it turned out to be really cool. You can see here as I go along that the paint marker looks pink when it's over the red and looks purple when it's over the blue. So I was really pretty pleased with that, and I think that's a fun thing to play with. So right here you can see where I took a moment to clean my paint marker nib on some scrap paper because it was picking up the color of the watercolor. So I was pretty happy with this two-tone effect that was created with just one marker. It really looks like I changed markers as I went across the watercolor. So I should listen to my own advice. I didn't test my marker and it came out in a big blob of paint. So sometimes the nib is dried up, sometimes a big blob of paint comes out. So it's good to test your marker before you get going on something like this. So I love these patterns that the watercolor left. Like I said, the way the watercolor dries, which is actually caused by ripples in the paper. So like I said, rippling is not always a bad thing. And then I'm just following these at the way nature freezes like ice, the way ice looks, the way ripples in water look, the way waves look coming into the shore, you know, so many different things in nature. So that's what I'm doing here. This light blue wasn't showing up very well on the turquoise watercolor, so I ended up switching to white. And later I even tried a different color, which I didn't like. So, but the white is kind of fun, very subtle and beautiful. And you can also vary the thickness of your line, you know, go back in. You don't have to stick with just the thickness that the nib is. And later in this video, I'm going to show you that chisel nib and how I use that nib. It's pretty easy to change the nib. You just pull it out. You can use tweezers, if you don't want to get your fingers messy, and replace it with the chisel nib. And then you have to get the ink to come down into that nib like you did when you started out. So it's going to give you a much thicker line. And I had fun using it on this pattern that you'll see. So I really enjoyed the Hippie Crafter supplies. I highly recommend them. The prices are fantastic, and I'm happy to support their brand. I'll include a link to their website in the description box. And if you're interested in watching more of these marker drawings develop, I'm going to post another video in the near future. I also have a video where I use oil-based markers on acrylic painted papers that you can check out. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks so much.